Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have Michael McCarthy, Chief Strategy Officer at Tiger Brokers Australia, to discuss inflation in the Australian market. It's great to have you with us, Michael. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thanks very much, Jill. Great to be here.
What is causing the inflation, and what is the ongoing economic impact of this?
Well, as we know, this is a global phenomenon. It's not just about Australia, but it's very clear that those record levels of central bank stimulus, the fiscal policies that have been implemented around the world by governments to support economies through the COVID crisis have resulted in real price pressure. And when we look at the disruption to supply chains that we're seeing around the globe because of those COVID disruptions, we've got a perfect storm for inflation. We've got both demand and supply factors contributing to very significant rises in prices. And we haven't seen inflation like this around the globe since the 1970s. I note the UK last week put in a reading at 9.1% on an annualized basis. These are very big numbers. So while it's certainly having an impact here in Australia, it's, as I say, a global phenomenon. One of the issues, though, for Australia in particular is that the lower level of the Australian dollar is helping to import a lot of those price pressures. So we've got a number of factors that are driving this inflation rate. It's very clear central banks are on the case. We've been talking about little else in markets for some time now, but there's not a lot Australia can do. As a standalone here, this is going to take a global effort.
What sectors and companies are expected to be winners and losers from inflation?
Well, we look to historical examples, but one of the issues for us, of course, is that it's been so long since we've had a period of higher inflation like this. So while we would look to sectors like consumer staples, for example, or possibly real estate investment trusts, that might not be the case this time around. And one of the reasons for that is the behaviour we've seen in markets in the lead up to these events. For the last 12 years or so, that record stimulus from central banks has supported all sorts of sectors, but in particular those that are interest rate sensitive. As interest rates tumbled around the world, investors increasingly sought returns. And so some of those sectors that have been favoured because of those returns, in particular real estate trusts, might not be the inflation hedge that we've expected. Another very disappointing performance so far has been from gold itself, traditionally considered an inflation hedge. The gold price has barely moved for months. It's stuck in a range between 1800 and 1860. And so it's a challenging time for investors because a lot of what we conventionally believe about inflation is possibly out of date, and some of the factors that we would turn to hedge against inflation are simply not working.
And Michael, let's talk about the Australian market more specifically. How is the global economy impacting it?
Well, although Australia boxes above its weight, if I can put it that way, with only 22 million people, it still only represents around 1.5 to 2% of the global economy. So the Australian economy is very much a cork floating on the global sea. What happens in Australia is a direct result of what's happening around the world, and particularly given Australia's status as highly enmeshed with the global community. Our biggest trade partners here are China and the US. What happens in those major economies will largely determine what happens here in Australia. One of the big factors that's really helped the Australian economy recently have been those higher commodity prices for commodities like natural gas, for coal, for iron ore, and those have delivered some surprising surpluses, particularly to state governments, at a time when we're expecting to see balance sheet damage for those state governments. So that is a real positive, but of course there's a potential flip side to that. If those commodity prices come away, the impact on Australia could be doubled. And so that's one of the most closely watched determinants of the outlook for the Australian economy.
Okay, Michael, we appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq.